Okay, good afternoon, Dad. Today is Friday, April 19th, and what the hell's going on? It
I
looked
can,
like yesterday there was, it looked like a huge strike. I was ready for World War III. I was
yeah,
telling
I thought I was
Ginger,
going to lose $10. I was really upset. Um,
am I
but
losing $10? What's going
I,
on?
it's kind of looking like I'm going to get the $10. Yeah,
All right, so what
you're
was
going to have to.
to
Yeah,
anybody that's listening, what was this $10 bet about? So we
they,
were,
well, I think we bet on whether Israel would retaliate in sufficient strength um, that
Iran.
yeah would be forced to escalate. In other words, the bet was over whether or not Israel would go up the escalatory ladder with the next
Mhm.
strike. And you said that it would happen by the end of this month, and I said that it wouldn't. And $10 was at stake, because actually, you can never. I think it's always a mistake to bet against Israeli recklessness.
Mhm.
I mean, in fact, that's been their past practice. They've had a strategy, a policy of escalatory dominance, meaning that any strike against Israel is going to be it's going to provoke a response, a disproportionate response. So let's say they kill, whatever group, the terrorists, so called, or a militia kills one Israeli. Israel is going to kill 10 of them or 100 of them. And then if they respond again, it'll continue. It will be, a greater number. And
Mhm.
just by with these overwhelming responses, they maintain this aura of invincibility. Um, so, it's, based on past practice, we should have expected something. You should have won your $10. But again, there was reports of significant Israeli missile strikes or drone strikes. It wasn't clear what was going on in Iran, and also I think at some bases in Iraq and Syria.
Mhm. That's
I
what I
think
heard too.
also radar installation. I heard, and it sounded like it was something quite major. Again, you've heard about different Iranian cities, and then it just kind of fizzled out. Israel never said anything. Iran said there were explosions, but it's not clear that there was any damage. We don't know exactly. I've heard that there were drones involved. I don't know. Some of the reports mentioned missiles, but I don't know what kind of missiles and where they were launched from, or if there really were missiles. It's just not clear right now what's happened. Um, but
So
it's not.
what do we know for sure? Because when I was watching the news, I saw they said 7 cities in Iran were attacked, and they had a map showing little explosions on
Yeah,
each of these. So it looked like a huge deal. Like,
right.
okay, wow, 7 cities were struck, and I was thinking there could have been, were they targeting just the city in general or military infrastructures? And then I heard that Iraq and Syria were struck as well, and I was like, okay, this is it. World War III, here we go. Iran's going to unleash the drones. And then I started hearing a few reports that the Iranians said that nothing really happened, that there was a few small quadcopters, a few tiny mini drones, but nothing that did any damage. But then when I'm watching the news here, it's the everything on CNN and MSNBC is just showing like, wow, the Israelis really showed them that they can strike at their nuclear bases, at all their military airfields, and that Israel made a strong point saying, you mess with us, we can hit you wherever you want. So once again, is this another just a a show attack, just like what we had before, kind of calibrated and coordinated for both sides to kind of say that they won again and to try to de-escalate?
Yeah.
What happened exactly?
Well,
To
I think we have to be honest at this point. We don't really know. I mean, it just, um, and I'm sure more information will come out. It sounds like it wasn't really a major strike. One thing in particular leads me to believe that, and that is that one of the members of the Israeli cabinet, one of the fanatics, and I use that word advisedly, he's a true fanatic, Ben Gvir, I
Ben
believe.
Gvir, I've heard of this guy.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not
He
sure.
referred to the strikes as this wasn't, I don't know what the Hebrew word, but the idea was pathetic.
Mhm.
And so he was greatly disappointed. He didn't think that it was much of anything. And that's coming from the Israeli side. Officially, Israel is not making any comments. So this stuff in the American media, well, these guys will just say anything. Um, so we don't really know. It just sounds like it wasn't, well, partly because Iran is downplaying it. It suggests that if they did any damage, it was relatively minor. So it was just some little show of force. I think that something that I was speculating about earlier may have, in fact, explained what happened. Again, Netanyahu's natural inclination is to escalate, and he's been itching for a war with Iran, as we've been saying. Somebody said 35 years. This is something he's been wanting to do. So all of his natural instincts were towards escalation, and then also he had a lot of pressure even within his own cabinet. Ben Gvir, for example, pushing him to make a major strike. But at the same time, it's clear that the U.S. and all the Western powers were telling Israel, please don't.
Right.
And my guess was that he would just take advantage of that and say, okay, well, we're going to do it, but if you really insist, I think you're going to have to give us a break on Rafah. For example, it was just speculation. Maybe we're going to go into Rafah, and I want you just to, shut up about it. We've had enough of flack from you, and no threats of, well, there's never going to be sanctions against Israel, but we're going into Rafah, and you're going to support us. That's what just as a guess, that he's like all politicians, he's a deal maker, and he just saw a chance. These people are desperate. Okay, you take advantage of that desperation, you get something from them, and it turns out, well, we don't know for sure, but there was a report in a Qatari newspaper citing Egyptian sources saying that that's indeed what happened. That Netanyahu had either called off or greatly reduced the strike that had been planned for a deal on I guess it would be wrong to say permission for going into Rafah, but it's full support for going into Rafah. So that may be indeed.
Do we have anything else to show that this is happening? Because I see the just coming out of the White House where Anthony Blinken or John Kirby will say, we don't support the decision to go into Rafah. They're not fully supporting it, but they're not saying no. Right. And I guess this is just their political posturing to say that, that we think there's better ways to go about it, but we're not here to tell the Israelis what to do.
Right.
That's kind of the position that the White House is taking.
Yeah, I think that you're going to expect them to say that.
Right.
Yeah, it's probably actually, but again, it sounds to me like it's a softening of their position right there. I mean, there were some pretty strong statements that were starting to come out of the White House. About Rafah and about, in general, about the Gaza campaign. And then I also saw it was a State Department spokesman who was being questioned by I think you see an AP reporter, Matt Lee, and he was asking him about just what we're saying about this deal, the Rafah deal. And the guy wouldn't give him a straight answer, which kind of made me think that, maybe there really is a Rafah deal. He just didn't go out and say no. He started, well, we really hope that, essentially you say they're going into Rafah, but, we're sure they're going to do it right and so forth. And he kept on saying, no, I'm asking you, was there this deal? And finally got around, no, there wasn't a deal.
I think I heard that. Yeah. It seemed very clear that there was. Why couldn't you just say that in the beginning that there's no deal?
Exactly,
right.
You
hum and hawed for a good minute without giving an answer.
Right. It sure sounded like somebody knew there was a deal and was trying to explain, but they're going to do it right. They can't do it right. They won't do it right.
So there hasn't been any official statement coming out of Israel yet about what they're doing. Has there been any move so far? I just see in the news, I saw another building, another family wiped out, but these things happen all the time.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's, one of the kind of costs of the Iran crisis is that it's taken our eyes off of Gaza and the international coverage of Gaza was pushed to the side for a while. But it's, the campaign of terror has continued. Nothing's changed. The same thing what I've heard is that a lot of Palestinians are going back north, and they're just finding where their homes are. Their homes are destroyed, but they're just pitching tents in those places where they had homes. But a lot of those refugees that are heading back to their ruined homes are being shot at and killed. But they're doing it. They're saying, this is my home and this is where I'm.
So do you think that Netanyahu and Israel will take advantage of this sort of the distraction of the threat of Iran to sort of to not escalate, but to expedite their genocide in Gaza?
Well,
are they going to?
I mean, that would have been potentially. I mean, they could have done it, but this last strike seems to be a de-escalation. And so, and if they go into Rafah, then all eyes will be on Rafah. I don't think they can escape that. But they're just going to go in knowing that they have the full support. I don't know that they really had much fear that the U.S. would, would in any way significantly impede, their attack on Rafah. But
so you think not for sure, but you're fairly certain that this Rafah attack will happen, or that Israel will invade.
I think it.
And it was a deal that was kind of reached with the United States. Say, hey, go into this last city in Gaza, destroy it, do whatever you want, and but just don't bomb the hell out of Iran because we don't want World War III.
Right.
You can kill these innocent people that can't shoot back.
Right.
Don't kill the people that can shoot back.
Right.
Is basically what we're telling them.
Yeah. I mean, right. It's sickening when you think about it, and that's the deal that Netanyahu was probably thinking. Yeah, actually, this Iran thing's getting kind of tricky.
He's probably a little scared too.
Yeah. Well, there's a story that's going around in Israel that he said that I guess it was somebody who was in the, what would you say, like the operations room and some of the military headquarters there during the Iran drone and missile attack. And he said that if the average Israeli could overhear what they were saying during those couple of hours, he said half of the population of Israel would be leaving the country.
Yeah, everybody was.
Yeah, because in other words, they were panicking. They were truly frightened.
I heard the same story that everybody was shitting their pants when it was happening. Like, oh my god! And this was a small volley. So I think there's got to be some sanity, hopefully, amongst the Israeli military leaders.
I think again, you find generally in these countries that there actually is more sanity within the military forces, military leadership than there is on the civilian side. Because these people, they're kind of they understand really what the capabilities are. They understand what the hardware is, what the limits are on their abilities. And it seems often that the civilians, and it's very true in the U.S., it's often the State Department. This is true going back even decades. The people in the State Department always want to go and bomb and think they can do anything, and they don't understand that there are limits and consequences and so on. It's not that the generals are peaceniks or doves or anything like that, but they tend to be more realistic.
They know just sort of the brass tacks of the logistics of whether or not something's feasible.
Right.
Politicians just like to think they can just will anything into existence.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you said that really Israel's foreign policy is built on the concept of escalatory dominance. But did we have escalatory dominance here? Does it count as escalatory dominance if you have a much weaker retaliation to what Iran did, but then you go around and blow the hell out of Gaza? No. Does that count?
I don't think it does. I mean, I think what they're doing in Gaza, again, it's so clear that they're unleashing their fury on a much, much weaker opponent, and everybody sees that. I don't think that, again, we think we discussed this earlier, that doesn't create so much fear as hatred. And what happened on April 14th in that Iranian attack is that a lot of people, people that really know the region well, like Chas Freeman, who's somebody I mentioned earlier, just a kind of a diplomatic legend, one of the greats that the U.S. State Department ever produced, says that on that day, things changed in the Middle East. That was really the end of escalatory dominance for Israel. And we can see it. That they, instead of going up the ladder, they went down. There
right.
sure appears to be, based on the reports that we have at this point, that they went down. They actually took a step back. And
If you watch the news, though, you hear the opposite.
Yeah,
So is
well,
the idea just to be? But what's the point
again,
of that? It's just to
right.
who are they lying to? Are they lying to the American people? But it seems like the Israelis themselves know that something has changed, right?
Right, yeah.
But if people in the United States, they just think like, man, Israel really kicks some ass,
Yeah,
and they're
right.
doing. They're still the dominant power in the Middle East.
Right.
Do the Israelis believe they're the dominant power in the Middle East anymore?
I don't think so. Actually, what was it? I think you mentioned a poll, and I heard the same thing later, that 2/3 of the population of Israel did not want to retaliate against Iran because
unless they had the full support of their allies.
Right. In other words, they're fearful. They realize this is not a fight that that they can't win on their own. And so that's why actually all along Netanyahu is trying to draw the U.S. in. And this time he was forced to, he met his match. He had been getting away with all these assassinations and constant attacks on Iran, through terrorist proxies and also direct attacks. But this time, when after the embassy bombing, in Damascus.
How many assassinations does Israel carry out against Iranians a year? Because I hear people say like, oh, they kill nuclear scientists all the time, military personnel.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if they kill them all the time, but years ago, you were hearing there were a number of nuclear scientists that were killed. There are only so many nuclear scientists that. In recent years, it's been generally like military officials within Syria. It's just like every other week you hear about some strike, and when they kill the official. There's always 10 people around them. That Syrians and
does Iran,
the driver, whatever.
Does Iran ever strike Israeli operatives when they're outside, or does Israel always operate within its safe zone?
Yeah, in general, they haven't. I mean, I've heard people say, well, there's the tit for tat shadow war, but it's pretty much tit and no tat. I mean, in other words, that in general, Israel, strikes with impunity, and they've gotten used to it. But what happened again, after this embassy strike, in Damascus, they didn't get away with it, and that was a big change, a direct attack on Israeli territory,
and Israel couldn't rise to escalate even further. They realize that they're at their capacity,
right? Because
they do. Do you think one of the reasons is they don't even have the real ability to strike, do a proper strike into Iran?
Yeah. Well, again, we were talking about that earlier. They don't have that. For example, they don't have air refueling ability. They're completely dependent on the U.S. to do that. So they can't fly jets from Israel, to Iran and then back. Before the jet returns to Israel, it'll run out of fuel. They do have submarines, so that was a possibility. I haven't heard anything about submarines. The drones are slow moving, as we know.
Right.
Like 3.5 to 5 hours.
Right.
So if drones were used in this attack, it may have been by some local proxy, which would most likely be, the proxy that Israel uses again and again is MEK. What is that? MEK is it's Mesolakak or something like that. It's a terrorist organization, a true terrorist organization that was actually fought on the side of Iraq against Iran in the Iraq-Iran war, and it's kind of like a sort of a very strange Marxist personality cult. It's really a creepy organization that hated by everyone in Iran. It's been responsible for all kinds of terrorist attacks and assassinations in Iran. For a long time, it was based in Iraq, and I think they now have their headquarters in Europe or something. The crazy thing, they were actually on the U.S. terrorist list for years and years. We too regarded them as a terrorist organization, but recently, due to pressure from Zionists, I think it was like 5 years ago or something, they were taken off of the terrorist list because it was understood by the Zionists, by Israel, that this was a useful organization. And they so often these attacks, these assassinations are carried out in conjunction with MEK. So quite possibly, if there were drones involved, they probably didn't come from Israel. They may have been launched within the territory of Iran, by MEK operatives.
It's so crazy to think that we fought a war on terror for 20 years, but then we are we use terrorist organizations like ISIS-K. We talk about as a CIA cutout. Now Israel uses MEK, and
worked with Al Nusra in Yemen. We're also kind of worked as the Air Force for Al Qaeda, the Al Qaeda in Yemen. And it happens again.
It's just
we
like
have a long history.
If all your buddies that are doing the work are terrorists, it's going to be like, are you the good guys anymore? Like, what are we doing here? You know?
Well, there's a kind of thinking. You just say, well, we're the good guys, and they're the bad guys. We're the U.S. and Iran. We all know they're the bad guys. So, but we got to be tough. We can't hesitate to use extreme measures or to fight dirty, because you just got to fight dirty when you're fighting the bad guys. And so there's just people stop, the ends justify the means. And I think that's the kind of thinking that these people go, but it just takes you down a very dark road to the point where you got to stop and ask, well, wait a second, what have we been doing for 30 years? What kind of people are we supporting? What kind of acts are we carrying out?
Right.
Really, who really is
the bad guy?
Yeah, right.
Right. Yeah. It's, it's so crazy to think about, but, okay. Anyways, with, I had a question and now it just completely slipped my mind. Sorry. I just drew a blank. I had a good question. You just have to believe me.
Okay.
It'll come back to me. All right. Well, we'll pivot until I can think of it. Okay. So, what does Israel do now? I mean, if they lost this escalatory dominance game, do you think they're going to try to strike even harder again, or they're just going to admit that they no longer are the dominant power? I mean, how does this play out?
I think they're likely to strike again, against Iran, and try to, maybe it's just again, Netanyahu saw a chance to get something out of the U.S. Maybe it's partly support for Rafah. It's me. They were probably giving a lot of grief over that. And he said, "Get off my back. We're going to do this." And they say, "Okay, yeah, just as long as you don't go into Iran, or you don't escalate into Iran." And then he maybe got something else out of them. I wouldn't be surprised. But the thing is, he's not going to change his spots. He's still committed to destroying Iran. I think he wants that to be his legacy, and he'll just somewhere down the road he'll try again. And it's not just him. It's not like if we got rid of Netanyahu, it's other people and a lot of people in Israel.
Do you think the hope for Israel was hoping that Iran would strike back immediately? Because Iran did give the message, says that that the matter was resolved after they sent that volley of missiles and drones. And he said that if Israel retaliates and strikes Iran, then Iran will strike immediately and using a lot more force than what we saw.
Right.
And so that's why I think I was so tense, and everybody was so tense that night when we heard that the 7 cities in Iran were hit. We're like, okay, here comes the Iranian response right away, right? Because that's what they said they were going to do. They have to stay good by the word, and it never happened. And do you think that Israel was trying to goad Iran into following up on what it said to strike quickly? And then Israel could say, like, look, we never even admitted that this was us doing it. And it was a very small attack, minor, huge overreaction. Yeah. Look at this monster Iran is. Is that...
It could be. Well, I mean, sure. I mean, again, it's just that Netanyahu and the others haven't abandoned their dream of Iran's ultimate destruction. And again, they see that they have to draw on the U.S. to do it, right? So, yeah, I'm sure that was, they decided, okay, well, I made this deal with the U.S., so we're just going to take it this far, not so much that, we draw ire from the Americans and they give me grief over Rafah and whatever. but maybe far enough to provoke the Iranians. Perhaps that's how he gauged it. That would be my guess.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I think as well. But the problem is now that everybody sees what's happening. Everybody knows that Israel is trying to goad Iran into a confrontation, and the
Yeah,
longer
well,
this goes on, Iran knows it, and they've shown themselves to be quite restrained and responsible.
right.
And the further this goes on, it looks like Israel just comes off as more and more reckless and just frankly evil in what they're doing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, well, I
by
think
trying to start a conflict.
right.
And so, like, I just don't, I think that this is just going to keep on getting worse and worse for Israel because,
Yeah, well, no, it's these last 6 months, or ever since October 7th, this has just been an ongoing disaster for Israel.
right, nobody was
Right.
really talking about
Right.
Israel and them being terrible people.
Right. It
6
was
months
actually
ago.
people who had forgotten about Palestine.
I even kind of forgot about
Right,
it. And,
right.
like, I've been to Palestine and
Right.
I was aware of the situation,
Right,
but
right.
past 10 years, it's just kind of, faded
Yeah.
from my mind a
Right.
bit.
Yeah.
So,
No, it's no. This has just been an ongoing disaster, and I think that all the world sees what Israel is now. All the world except for the U.S. and the UK and Germany. Somewhat.
well, I'd say a
but-
lot of the U.S. and UK know, but it's just becoming more and more apparent that our government is bought and paid for by the Israeli lobby.
Yeah,
You see it every time. Right after this attack, all of these politicians out saying like, we stand by Israel. Israel has the right to defend itself. And then you click on the post, and you see underneath it, always the first comment is, this person gets $1.2 million a year from AIPAC.
Right.
And you see every single one of our politicians, or 90% of them, are bought and owned by Israel, or by the Israeli lobby.
Right.
And that's kind of, there's always this kind of conspiracy and just sort of just the crazy thing to say, the Jews always run the world. And I always thought that was silly. And we shouldn't say Jews; we should say Zionists, because these are the Israeli lobby is not. We don't want to conflate it with Judaism. But it's really true, right? It seems to be true. Like,
Yeah, right.
how do they get their tentacles through all of Western Europe, and America and Canada? Like, any other country that isn't under the influence of Israeli money, the Israeli lobby, can see this so clearly,
Right.
and even the people in these countries can see it, but their governments are beholden to to all this money coming from Israel. Where do they get the money? How do they do this? How do they figure it out?
Well, again, in the U.S., for example, it really is Jewish oligarchs, and largely Jewish Zionist, organizations, lobbies like AIPAC, AIPAC being the best known, that really have an outsized influence on the government. I mean, this is, again, it's not a crackpot conspiracy theory. Like the best known work on this is Mearsheimer and Waltz. I guess you say Walt and Mearsheimer, so Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer's book, The Israel Lobby, that came out about close to 20 years ago. And when it did, it caused something of an uproar, and they were accused of being anti-Semites, and they took a lot of flack. And again, these are two very well-respected scholars in their fields, the political scientists, John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago and Stephen M. Walt from Harvard. But in spite of their well-established, reputations, all their credentials, they took a lot of flack, and they were pilloried, again, as anti-Semites. And but boy, now I think that a lot of people are, who at the time may have just assumed that, that's ridiculous, they're exaggerating or whatever. People can see it now. I mean, it's just because the double standard is just so obvious, so extreme. I mean, it's just the ridiculous, the obvious lying on the part of Israel and our government on behalf of Israel is there for everybody to see. Anybody who's going to pay attention, who makes any kind of effort to try to understand what's going on, Now, there are a lot of people who don't make an effort and still believe in these things about Israel, but I would say, like in these last 6 months or so, the number of people who've had their eyes opened about Israel and the Israel lobby is it has it's got to have doubled, tripled, quadrupled.
Can you explain a little bit how it works? Does the Israeli lobby basically buy politicians to show support for Israel, and then those politicians vote to approve and send money to Israel, which then goes back to the lobby where they use our own money to buy off our own politicians?
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate
So they
description. I mean, you have well, you
that's
have
such a horror. That's such a clear grift. That people should say that that's not okay.
Yeah,
you can't have a foreign country.
Well, there was an effort. I think actually that John F. Kennedy has, one of their all kinds of theories about why John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and one of them is that he, was going to cross the Israel lobby. And that may not be true. I have no idea, but it's not
impossible.
I believe it. Well, the fact is that, as we can see, just the Mossad has assassinated a lot of people, a lot of foreign leaders over the years. There's some assassinated some very well.
What are some of the most high profile ones?
Okay, there was Bernadotte. This was around the time of the establishment. I think he was a Swedish. Oh, I can't remember. We're talking about a prime minister, or like a UN representative
from Sweden.
Yeah, and he was assassinated by Israeli operatives.
And did Sweden know this?
Oh yeah, I think it was very.
This is what's crazy as well. Israel will blow up the USS Liberty, and the United States does nothing, doesn't say anything. They just killed our Navy men.
Right.
They say, "Oh, it's fine, deep six it." They assassinate some UN official or they said prime minister or whatever of Sweden. This Bernadotte guy. Sweden does nothing.
Well, I don't know if they didn't do anything then. I mean, there was. I should go back and look into the details of that. But there used to be some pushback and there used to be some consequences. Like I told you, for example, President Eisenhower, was kind of viewed Israel with suspicion and kept them at arm's length. And when they went on that escapade, the Suez, known as the Suez Crisis now, in I believe 1956, in conjunction with Israel and France, he pulled the plug on it, and he didn't pay any consequence. These days, like every U.S. president is terrified to make any sort of or impose any kind of constraints on Israel, right? But he could do that back then. He didn't suffer any consequences. You could be critical of Israel back in the 1950s, but there really was a turning point, I think with USS Liberty more and the 1967 war in general. But then even as late as like in the 1980s, the conservatives who are now generally extreme Zionists forget that Reagan would not go and speak before AIPAC because he felt that it was beneath the dignity of a U.S. president to go before a foreign lobby and pander to them.
Right,
but now every president does, right?
It's so crazy because we had this whole RussiaGate scandal saying, oh, Russia's interfering in our elections and in our complete bogus,
right?
And it's been proven again and again. But we have this very open other foreign government, Israel,
right,
that openly is paying all of our politicians. Talk about influence from a foreign entity.
Right,
that's the most obvious one.
Yeah,
they literally control our government.
Yeah. Well, certainly when it comes to Israel-related policy, there's just no question about it. I mean, we have the lobbies.
How is that even legal if it have a foreign?
Well, actually, it should not be legal. Because we have this foreign agent registration law, and that according to that law, and this was something I think that John F. Kennedy was pushing, the Israel lobby should have been. AIPAC should have registered as a foreign agent. That's what they are. Quite clearly, that's what they are. And every other, a lobby that represents the government of Turkey, for example, or whatever, they've got to register. They do. Every other country in the world does, but not Israel. And that exception was made back in the 1960s.
Who made that exception?
Well, I guess it was probably Lyndon Johnson again. It was because it was
what a cruddy president.
So we have these, the Israel lobby, AIPAC, and a lot of associated, pressure groups that Jewish Zionists and then Christian Zionists. Now, Christian Zionists are important because they represent a lot of numbers and they're voters and so on. But I think you have to be understood as their subsidiary. They're just taking their lead from the Jewish Zionists. But yeah, they're responsible for what they do. I'm not cutting them any slack. But okay, we have these lobbies, but then we also have, I think, which it's fair to call Jewish oligarchs. People like, it used to be Sheldon Adelson. He died a few years ago, but his widow's still there with a fortune. And then he was on the Republican side, and then he was the single largest donor, to Republican candidates. And then you had Saban on the Democratic side. She's still there. And then both of them, they were, extreme Zionists. And it's not just them. Those are just the number one on both sides. And so, like, if you're going to be president, you have to get their blessing. So this is again, it's not some wild conspiracy theory. They're out there. It's obvious. And it's not just them. Like, out of the top 10 donors on both sides, you have something like 5 of them are extreme Zionists, are Jewish oligarchs.
It's crazy. It's so crazy so we basically, let me summarize this and see if I got it right. So basically, Lyndon B. Johnson basically allowed Israel to infiltrate our lobby system, right? They don't have to register as a foreign agent. So Israel is the only country that's able to directly influence our politics as a foreign country. And what they do is they buy off our politicians, and you can see the amount of money AIPAC gives to every single one of our congressmen and women, all of our senators, how much Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are getting. They're giving them tons of money, hundreds of millions of dollars going through AIPAC to purchase our politicians, which they then they get the politicians to push forward any pro-Israel policy forward, plus giving them billions of dollars to Israel, right? Which then goes back into AIPAC. And then we use a portion. AIPAC uses some of that money some of the money and the weapons to blow up innocent Gazans, and then uses the rest of the money to continue buying our politicians, to keep giving money to Israel. And Israel keeps on using that money to continue on its ethnic cleansing of the land and to keep on buying up politicians around the world. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a fair, right.
That's wild. That's so crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but it's an accurate description.
Is it falling apart now? I mean,
I was going to say,
now that if people can see that, like if people can just understand that loop that's happening,
I think also an important part of this is that you have a media that's also very compliant, and if a large reason for that, it has to be said, it's true. Again, it's not a wild conspiracy theory, but a lot of major media is run by Jews, and in the past, and I think it's still true, like the ones who actually run, the legacy media, the New York Times, for example, whatever, are very extreme Zionist Jews, and so that that's one thing. It's like the politicians, there's the money, but then there's just the pressure that comes from the media, and if they step out of line, what happens? You get slammed in the media. You're an anti-Semite, whatever. And, AIPAC goes and finds somebody to run against you in the primary, pumps them full of money, and then, you're out of office.
Right.
And that, you're getting hit both, from all these stories on TV and in the papers and whatever, accusing you of all kinds of things. And politicians run scare. Now, the only thing, I mean, again, the reason to hope is that actually there is, as we've said earlier, a shift, especially among younger Jews who have become disillusioned with Israel, who do not have that loyalty to Israel that their parents and grandparents did. And so you do find, more and more, some of the most articulate and diehard. I know that often like Jews that have taken up the Zionist cause haven't really taken it up fully. It's like, you can't criticize Israel too much. They still sort of acted as gatekeepers. Again, we mentioned that your grandpa and my father, he headed a division of Palestinian Christian organization. And I remember talking about, he's the farthest thing from being an anti-Semite. but he was just saying this is a problem. You get these, the Jewish Zionists come in and then they start to act as gatekeepers. You say, oh, we can't have this person. You say, look, what's this all about? We should just, unite. We all agree, on what's happening here. It's not just the fact that you're Jewish doesn't give you a right to push other people out of the movement. And that's something that you saw happen again and again. But the feeling I get is with a lot of people like this, these people are truly, fully disillusioned. I mean, it's an unconditional opposition to Zionism. It's not a Zionism up to, Zionism, or I'm anti-Zionist, but, it's no, I'm anti-Zionist. I'm fully, I full support, unconditional support for the Palestinians. I think you're starting to see that actually among younger Jews, and that could be very important. That could really change things here in the U.S.
Also, I think the term anti-Semite is losing a lot of its power. Yeah. It's just the same thing that happened when everybody was calling everybody racist. Everybody was calling everybody sexist. Once everybody's racist and sexist, then people are like, well, nobody's racist and sexist anymore.
Right.
Or you just thought it just loses its effect. And I feel like Israel's gone a little bit too far.
They play that card too much.
Yeah, right. Everyone's being labeled anti-Semite, and everybody's starting to say, like, well, what is even a Semite? Aren't the Palestinians Semitic people? Right. And they are. And so you're like, what do you, just more of these rules for thee, but not for me type of thing. And people are starting to see through it.
Right. Yeah. It's one of those kind of, let's say, magic words that are supposed to silence people. And it's starting to lose its power. And that, again, is an encouraging development.
Do you know how much money we give to Israel every year?
Well, for the it's probably gone up, but I know for the longest time it's been like $3 billion a year, and like just direct aid. Just
and what how does indirect aid, like AIPAC, is that indirect?
Or okay,
I'm just kind of curious how the money flows.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just I think just government to government. It's been for the longest time like $3 billion. I think it wasn't too long ago. And I think maybe it was under Obama that it was agreed that like over the next 10 years, we'd give them $30 billion, $3 billion a year. But there are other things. There are all kinds of breaks that Israel gets. So I don't know if you really added it up and look at indirect support, and it's probably a lot more of that, military equipment provided at a discount or whatever. There are all kinds of things that the Israelis can get away with that other countries can't. Okay, but yeah, that direct government to government aid is about $3 billion.
$3 billion, and then some extra that we don't know about. So it could be 3 to 10 billion is where you're in range. All right, so we'll just say $3 billion plus. The reason I asked is just when I kind of think about just the horrible suffering of the Palestinian people over the past 75 years. All these massacres and getting their land taken and stolen, and people being evicted and killed in their homes. It's like, why couldn't we just use that money and they could have slowly just purchased the land, and then there would have been way less animosity. I'm sure that would have been feasible. To some extent, I'm sure some people would have moved, but like I just saw Israel just took another 2,000 acres in the West Bank recently. Just take it. Yeah. It's like, we gave you $3 billion. Why don't you buy that 2,000 acres? You could buy it, right? I mean,
well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. Well, they do that, but it's often, it's considered, a betrayal by the Palestinians. There are people that sell out to the Israelis and will sell their land. I think in general, there's just a great deal of resistance because the Palestinians understand what's going on as part of an ethnic cleansing.
Right.
And so there's a lot of, internal pressure within the community to do that.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just thinking like they could have just, slowly just purchased different properties and you could just live in harmony with the people. Clearly kicking them out of their homes and demolishing their homes and killing them is going to cause some tensions, with your neighbors. So
I say again, it's a policy. They're not trying to end the tensions. It's just, again, it's a policy of escalatory dominance, which is just, it's security through terror. You're by terrorizing, your neighbors, you hope to make yourself secure. Just like if you moved into this house, instead of going, knocking on the door and say hi and shaking hands and maybe offering a present and saying, hey, come over, let me know what I can help you. Yeah, exactly. Rather you set up machine gun nests and start like gunning down their dogs and whatever.
Right.
And that way they won't bother and you'll be secure.
Yeah, it just seems like such a short-sighted policy that they decided to go down this road. And like you said, because once you've committed down this path, there's no really turning it
Right.
around at this point.
Right.
When
Well,
you,
it's the problem is that that's how Israel was created. It was never anything different. There's some people like to think that there was a good old Israel. The secular Ashkenazis and the leftists and their kibbutzes and whatever. But it began, on the basis of terror. It was the Nakba, which was a great ethnic cleansing, and that involved many atrocities, many massacres, and 700,000 Arabs driven from their lands. That's how it began. That was the establishment of the state of Israel, and that's always been true. And the thing is that the world wasn't looking very closely at the time. There was a great deal of sympathy for Jews because World War II had just ended, and everybody knew that the Jews had suffered terribly. So people wanted to think the best. But even then, there was a lot of concern, and a lot of American diplomats back then. Our State Department wasn't run by Zionists, and there were a lot of reports back to Washington saying, "Hey, this is the bad stuff's going on, and we're going to suffer the consequences down there, in the future." And many diplomats advised against support for the state of Israel.
yeah, so can you do a brief history of how Israel was created in 1940s? It was 1947, right? 1948.
1947, 1948. Well, it was the
So they just what I gather is that after World War II, Zionist Jews started to show up in
right.
Palestine en
It
masse.
had started before then. I mean, it goes back, I think, actually, to like the Zionist idea kind of first was put forward at the end of the 19th century. I'll just give you a real sketch. I'm not. It's been a while since I've read the history, but I think Theodor Herzl is considered the founder of Zionism, and it has to be pointed out that it was an entirely secular phenomenon. Now we talk about the white-eyed religious fanatics or whatever, but it was secular Jews that came up with this idea and pushed it, and they didn't have support actually within the religious Jewish community.
Okay.
It was viewed with suspicion, because it was quite obvious. They saw this isn't the Messiah. These are just secular Jews here. We don't have anything to do with this. So to this day, you have some sects of Judaism that are anti-Zionist. But anyway, yeah, beginning in the early 20th century, this was after World War One, when Turkey was defeated and the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and the British took over that part of the Middle East. Back then, it was called the Near East, and so they had control of Palestine. And so, starting then, there was pressure, among wealthy, influential European Jews on the British government to create a homeland, for the Jews. And Jews began to some certain numbers. At first the numbers were relatively small, but Jews began to immigrate into the area. And back starting in the 1920s, there were conflicts. The local Arabs, some of them became alarmed and began to realize they were being pushed out, and so there were clashes, but it was all on a relatively small scale. And it was after World War II, where you had great numbers of European Jews showing up in Israel. Well, back then it was Palestine. And the numbers increased to the point where the Jews in Palestine realized that they could, that they had the upper hand. They also were, developing these militias, and so it was at 1947, 1948 that they struck. It was actually, well, I mean, it was, yeah, again, I have to go back to the details, but it was, there was, in the United Nations, there was a resolution, I think, dividing the land between the Palestinians and the Jews. And before, I'm not sure what the original boundaries are, but it may have been roughly 50%, 50%. But the Jewish militias, they struck, and drove a lot of these Palestinians. They were supposed to be able to share. Again, I don't know. We'll have to go back and look at that. Maybe we can talk about it in greater detail later. But yeah, the Jews in Palestine just seized the opportunity, seized the land, drove Palestinians, from a lot of these cities, towns and villages throughout Palestine. And they drove them into, two main regions. One was Gaza and the other was the West Bank. And that's where many of the refugees ended up. And there's a certain number remained within what became Israel. So to this day, we have maybe 20% of the population of Israel is Arab. Those are the original Palestinians that weren't driven off of the land. The others ended up in the West Bank and Gaza. So, when we're talking about Gaza, these are the descendants of refugees from 1948 who were, driven into this sliver of land, into refugee camps.
Their homes used to be in places like Tel Aviv or Haifa.
Right. Yeah. And the same, the West Bank.
Oh, yeah. It is. I feel like if people learn the history, it's just, a lot of people like to think like it's complicated in the Middle East, but it's really not that complicated.
Right.
So this land, the Palestinians had it, and then the Jews started coming in mass after World War II, and then just
I think
just created some massacres and drove them out of their homes. So that's basically it, right?
I think like before 1947, 1948, there was some violence. It wasn't, but in general, it was economic. They started buying up land, and it was incremental. But it was after World War II when the process of settlement, accelerated, and it was in 1948 that the Nakba, there's kind of this great ethnic cleansing occurred.
Right, the Nakba means the disaster in Arabic, right?
Right.
Okay, well, I think we can probably end here. It's a good little history lesson. Good for me to also remember and review.
Yeah, forgive me for not remembering all the details, but that's a broad sketch of what happened. I think the fundamentals are all correct.
It still blows my mind when I go back and think about the fact that we give so much money to Israel, and Israel uses this money to buy our own politicians.
Yeah,
it's really crazy. I think more and more people are waking up to that understanding, but that's such a huge problem. We can't have everyone's talking about democracy. What kind of democracy you have if a foreign government has all your politicians on payroll?
Right.
And,
no, it's right. It should be a true scandal, and it should be talked about openly. And we have to, completely just stop worrying about being called an anti-Semite. It's just like, this is an absurdity. We need to speak the truth. We can see the consequences right now. They're horrific. They're just absolutely horrific.
Right. 100%. Okay. Well, last question. Do you think that Israel is going to try and strike Iran again? Or do you think that that the crisis has been averted?
Well, I think maybe in the short run, it's been averted, but not in the long run. I was just saying again, that Netanyahu and others in Israel they haven't abandoned their, they haven't, they still are, they're thirsting for war with Iran. It remains their ambition, and they're just going to look for another opportunity. They're going to strike. Maybe they'll say, this isn't the moment. Let's deal with Gaza first, and then we'll go after Iran.
Right. And when dealing with Gaza may have repercussions as well.
Yeah.
It will. The world will see it. Yeah. And, there might be strikes from Hezbollah or, Egypt or Jordan. It's a very volatile situation.
Oh, yeah. It remains a very, very dangerous situation. I wouldn't say,
crisis temporarily averted.
Temporarily, probably even. It's just, who knows? It's just there are those elements within the Israeli government. Netanyahu himself is not, you can't, again, that's the reason I'm not going to bet more than $10 on these things. I think he probably is going to hold off for a while, but he's reckless and he's evil, and who knows what he'll do.
Still 11 days left in the month, so I can
Yeah,
still win.
you could.
I hope not. If we do future bets, let's bet a bottle of whiskey. I think that's better,
Okay.
and we'll do that. So $10 now. We'll do a bottle of whiskey next time. Okay, well, I think hear my son calling for us, so
Okay.
we'll end it now. Okay, thanks a lot, Dad.
All right.